I thought love was supposed to feel like safety, not silence. But the first time I realized I was wrong was on a night that smelled like rain and regret in downtown Chicago. I remember standing outside the glass doors of Carter Tower, my hands wrapped tightly around the sleeves of my coat, watching the city blur into streaks of gold and gray under the streetlights. Ethan Carter had once told me I would never have to be afraid again, that the world he lived in was dangerous for everyone except me, and I believed him the way people believe in gravity, without question, without doubt, until the night I saw him forget I existed. It started small, the way all dangerous things do. Late calls that ended before I could ask a question. Meetings that lasted longer than the excuses he gave me. Silence that used to feel peaceful slowly turning into something heavier, something that pressed against my chest, even when he was standing right in front of me. I told myself it was his world, his responsibility, the weight of everything he carried that I could never fully understand. Ethan was not just a man. He was control dressed in calm words, a presence that made entire rooms adjust their breathing when he entered. And I was the one place he let himself be human. At least that is what I used to believe. That night, I remember the rain falling harder, tapping against the glass like it was trying to warn me. I had come to surprise him, something I had not done in months, carrying a small envelope of sketches I knew he would never truly look at, but always pretended to appreciate. The elevator ride to the top floor felt longer than usual, every number lighting up like a slow confession I was not ready to make. When the doors opened, the hallway was too quiet, too still, the kind of silence that does not feel empty but occupied. I should have turned back then. I think about that often now, how instinct speaks before truth is ready to be heard. I followed the sound of faint laughter down the corridor, soft, unfamiliar, not the kind Ethan used when he was with me. It led me to the open doors of his private lounge, where warm light spilled across polished stone floors like something alive. I saw him before he saw me. Ethan Carter standing near the window, his posture relaxed in a way I had never witnessed before, as if the world itself had loosened its grip on him. And beside him was a woman I did not recognize, close enough that the space between them felt like something I was not supposed to interrupt. For a moment, I did not move. I simply stood there, holding my breath as if oxygen might betray me if I used it too loudly. Ethan's head tilted slightly as he spoke to her, a quiet smile forming that I had only ever seen once before, on a night he told me I was his piece. My name never left his lips that night. Not once. It was not the sound of betrayal that broke me in that moment. It was the absence of recognition, as if the world I had built inside his silence had never existed at all. The moment I saw him not see me, something inside my chest went completely still, like the world had pressed pause on everything except the sound of my own heartbeat. I remember standing there in that hallway, the polished floor reflecting the warm light behind him, watching Ethan Carter speak to a woman I had never seen before, as if she belonged in his world in a way I no longer did. I should have left. I should have turned around and taken the elevator back down to the street where the rain would have at least made sense. But instead, I stayed. Because sometimes the mind refuses to accept what the heart already understands. I took one step forward, then another, my shoes barely making a sound against the stone, until I was close enough to hear fragments of their conversation. Nothing alarming, nothing dramatic, just ordinary words exchanged in an ordinary tone that felt wrong coming from him. Because nothing about Ethan had ever been ordinary to me. He had always been precision and control. A man who measured silence the way others measured time. And yet here, he was laughing softly, leaning slightly toward her, as if the weight he carried every day had suddenly become lighter in her presence. I remember the envelope in my hand suddenly feeling heavier, the sketches inside no longer important, just paper pretending to matter in a moment where everything else was shifting. My fingers tightened around it as I tried to convince myself there was an explanation, that I was misunderstanding something I did not fully see. But then his head turned slightly, just enough that I could see his profile, just enough that I could see the expression on his face, and it was not guilt that hit me first, it was distance. Not physical distance, but something worse, something absolute, as if I had been placed outside a door that would never open again. I do not know how long I stood there before I finally spoke, my voice smaller than I expected it to be, almost swallowed by the room itself. "Ethan," I said, and it was the first time I had ever said his name like that, without warmth, without certainty, without belonging. The sound seemed to interrupt something, because the woman beside him turned first, her expression curious, while Ethan slowly shifted his attention toward me. And in that single moment, I watched his face change, not into recognition, but into something closer to inconvenience, as if I were a detail he had not accounted for in an otherwise controlled environment. "Emily," he said finally, my name sounding unfamiliar in his voice, like it had been stored somewhere he no longer visited often. There was no shock in him, no rush toward me, no immediate explanation. Just a pause, brief and controlled, before he looked back at her as if deciding how to continue the moment I had interrupted. That was when I understood something I had not been willing to accept before. I was not part of his world in the way I thought I was. I was something he visited, something temporary, something contained within boundaries I had never seen clearly until now. The silence between us stretched, and I became aware of how still I was standing, how out of place my presence felt in a room designed for people who never questioned where they belonged. I wanted him to say something that would fix it, something simple, something human, but Ethan Carter did not move toward fixing things that no longer served a purpose. Instead, he stepped slightly away from the window, his posture adjusting with quiet precision, as if resetting himself back into control. And when he spoke again, his voice was calm, almost careful, as if I were a situation rather than a person. "I did not expect you tonight," he said. Those words should not have hurt as much as they did, but they landed with a clarity that made everything before it feel like a misunderstanding I had been choosing to ignore. I glanced at the woman beside him, then back at him, searching for something, anything that resembled the man who once told me I was the only place he could breathe. But the version of him I was looking for did not appear. Instead, I saw a man who had already moved forward without asking me to follow. The envelope in my hand slipped slightly as my grip loosened, and I realized I had been holding on to it as if it could anchor me to a moment that had already ended. My voice came out quieter this time, almost fragile, as I asked him what this was. Not because I did not know, but because I needed to hear him say it. Ethan looked at me for a long moment, and I remember thinking that silence can sometimes answer more honestly than words ever do. When he finally spoke, it was not cruel, not loud, not dramatic. It was simply final in a way I was not prepared for. "It is complicated," he said, as if that explanation could contain everything that was collapsing between us. And in that instant, standing in a room that suddenly felt too large for me to survive inside, I realized that love, at least the version I had built my life around, does not always end with betrayal that screams. Sometimes it ends with a sentence spoken quietly by someone who has already left you behind while still standing in front of you. I remember the exact moment the air between us stopped feeling like air and started feeling like something I could not breathe through anymore. Ethan Carter did not move toward me, did not reach out, did not show even the smallest hesitation, and that absence of reaction was louder than any confession he could have made. I stood there holding the envelope of sketches like it suddenly belonged to someone else, my fingers stiff, my thoughts moving too slowly to protect me from what I was seeing. The woman beside him shifted slightly, glancing between us with polite confusion, as if I were an unexpected detail in a conversation that had already moved on. Ethan's attention returned to me only briefly, and when it did, it carried none of the familiarity I had once mistaken for permanence. It was measured, controlled, distant in a way that felt almost rehearsed. "Emily," he said again, as if repeating my name was enough acknowledgement to satisfy whatever obligation remained. I tried to speak, but my voice did not come out the way I expected. It felt smaller, stripped of certainty. I asked him what was happening, not because I truly needed an answer in that moment, but because silence was becoming too heavy to stand inside. He exhaled slowly, a controlled breath that felt like it belonged to someone managing a situation rather than a relationship, and that realization alone made something inside me tighten. The woman beside him excused herself softly, stepping away with careful distance, leaving the space between us more exposed. Ethan watched her leave, then turned back to me, and for the first time since I had known him, I saw something in his expression that was not emotional conflict, but emotional finality. He told me to come inside, not as an invitation, but as a direction, and I followed because my body moved before my mind could decide otherwise. The lounge felt warmer now, almost suffocating in its calm luxury, every surface reflecting a life I had been allowed to touch, but never truly inhabit. I placed the envelope on a nearby table without thinking, as if it no longer had weight, as if I no longer had reason to carry it. Ethan stood near the window again, looking out at the city lights below, as if they were more familiar to him than I was, and that thought struck me harder than anything else. I asked him again, slower this time, what I was supposed to understand, and there was a long pause before he answered. Not because he was searching for words, but because he was choosing them carefully, the way he always did when truth needed to be contained rather than expressed. He said it was not what I thought, but he did not explain what it actually was. Instead, he spoke about timing, about pressure, about things that required distance, and each word felt like it was removing me from a place I had never realized I was already standing outside of. I told him I did not understand how distance could exist between two people who shared everything, and when I said it, I saw something flicker across his face, not guilt, not regret, but something closer to recognition of a fact he had already accepted. He turned slightly toward me then, fully this time, and I waited for him to correct me, to deny me, to pull me back into the version of reality I had been living in. Instead, he told me that I had misunderstood the nature of what we were. The sentence was simple, almost gentle, but it landed with a weight that made my chest feel hollow. I remember looking at him, searching his face for even a fragment of hesitation, but there was none. Everything about him was composed, as if this moment had already been resolved somewhere in his mind long before I walked into it. I asked him if I meant anything to him at all, and the question hung in the air longer than I expected it to. He did not answer immediately, and in that silence I realized something I had been avoiding since the moment I saw him in this room. The absence of an answer was the answer. When he finally spoke, he said I was important, but importance was not the same as belonging, and I think that was the first time I understood the difference between being valued and being chosen. I stepped back without realizing I had moved, my hand brushing against the edge of the table for balance, and I felt the envelope slide slightly under its own weight, as if even it no longer wanted to stay with me. Ethan watched me then, not with anger, not with urgency, but with a quiet distance that suggested I was already leaving even if I had not yet turned around. And in that moment, standing in a room filled with light that no longer reached me, I understood that some endings do not arrive with destruction, they arrive with clarity, and clarity is sometimes the most irreversible thing of all. I did not remember walking out of the room, but I remember the moment the light behind me stopped feeling warm and started feeling like something I had left behind. The hallway outside Ethan Carter's lounge looked exactly the same as it had before I entered, yet everything about it felt different, as if the air itself no longer recognized me as someone who belonged there. My steps were slow, not because I was thinking, but because my body no longer trusted where it was going. I held the envelope loosely now, almost forgetting it was still in my hand until I felt the edge press against my palm. The sketches inside had once felt important, something personal, something meant to be shared, but now they felt like artifacts from a version of myself that had not yet learned the truth. Behind me, I heard the faint sound of a door closing, soft and controlled, and I knew without turning that Ethan had not followed me. That realization should have heard immediately, but instead it arrived in waves, delayed, as if even my emotions were struggling to process the distance that had just been created. I reached the elevator and pressed the button, watching the metal doors reflect my face in a distorted fragment of light. I did not recognize my own expression. It was not sadness in the way I expected. It was emptiness shaped like confusion, like my mind was still trying to find the moment where everything changed and failing to locate it. When the elevator arrived, I stepped inside alone, and the doors closed with a sound that felt final in a way I was not ready to accept. The descent felt slower than before, each floor passing like a quiet reminder that the world above me was continuing without interruption, without awareness of what had just collapsed inside me. When I reached the ground level, the lobby was still alive with movement, people passing through glass doors, conversations blending into the low hum of city noise outside, but none of it reached me in the same way anymore. I walked through it without acknowledgement, my presence feeling temporary, like I was passing through someone else's reality rather than my own. Outside, the rain had not stopped. It fell steadily, washing the streets in reflections of headlights and neon signs, turning the city into something softer and more distant. I stepped onto the sidewalk and let the cold air hit my face, expecting it to wake me up, to force clarity, but instead it only made everything sharper. I stood there for a moment, unsure of where to go, because the place I had come from no longer felt like something I could return to, and the place I was going no longer existed in a form I could recognize. My phone buzzed in my pocket, once, then again, but I did not look at it immediately. I already knew it was him, and I was not ready to hear a version of his voice that might pretend nothing had changed. Eventually I answered, holding the phone close but not pressing it fully to my ear. His voice came through calm, steady, familiar in a way that now felt almost unfamiliar. He asked where I was, not urgently, but with the same controlled tone he used when everything around him was under control and expected to remain that way. I told him I was outside, and there was a pause, brief but noticeable, as if he was recalculating the situation. He asked if I was coming back up, and that question stayed in my mind longer than it should have, because it assumed something that no longer felt true. I looked back at the building, at the glass tower rising into the rain, and I realized I was no longer thinking about going back inside. I told him no, quietly, and the word felt heavier than I expected. There was another pause on the line, longer this time, and when he spoke again, his voice was unchanged, but something beneath it had shifted slightly, not in emotion, but in distance. He said we should talk tomorrow, as if tomorrow still belonged to the same version of us that existed an hour ago. I did not answer immediately. Instead, I watched the rain hit the pavement, breaking into smaller patterns that disappeared as quickly as they formed, and I thought about how easily something could exist in one moment and be gone in the next without any visible destruction. When I finally spoke again, I told him I did not think there was anything left to talk about. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I simply said it as if I was stating something I had just learned rather than something I had lost. The silence that followed felt longer than anything that had happened inside the building. When the line finally disconnected, I stood there holding the phone, listening to the city continue around me as if nothing had changed, and for the first time, I understood that endings do not always announce themselves with force. Sometimes they arrive quietly, in a hallway, between two people who once believed they were the same world, and then slowly become strangers in the space of a single breath. I stood outside in the rain longer than I meant to, not because I had nowhere to go, but because every direction suddenly felt like it belonged to a version of my life that no longer existed. The city around me kept moving, headlights cutting through wet streets, people passing under umbrellas without looking up, as if nothing important had just ended inside a glass tower above me. I pressed my phone back into my pocket, my fingers still cold from holding it, and tried to understand why silence from him felt louder than anything he had ever said to me. Ethan Carter had always been certainty, even when I did not fully understand what that certainty cost. But now that certainty had turned into something distant, something that no longer included me. I started walking without a clear destination, my steps slow against the sidewalk, the rain blending with the sound of traffic until everything became one continuous noise that made thinking difficult. I told myself I would go home, but even the word home felt unfamiliar, like it belonged to a life that had quietly stepped away without asking for permission. After a few blocks, I stopped under the edge of a small awning outside a closed cafe, watching water run down the glass like it was erasing reflections one layer at a time. My phone buzzed again, and this time I did not hesitate. I looked at the screen expecting his name, but it was not him. It was a message from someone I had not thought about in months, a simple check-in from a friend asking if I was still in Chicago. I stared at it for a long moment, unsure how to answer something so ordinary when everything inside me felt unrecognizable. I typed back that I was fine, even though the word fine no longer held any meaning. The truth was I did not know what I was. The rain slowed slightly, turning from heavy sheets into a softer rhythm, and I realized I had been standing in the same spot long enough for my feet to grow numb. I began walking again, this time without direction or expectation, letting the city carry me forward. At some point, I found myself near the river, where the wind was colder and the lights reflected across the water in broken lines. I leaned against the railing and watched it move, thinking about how everything that once looked stable could still shift without warning. Ethan had told me once that his world required distance, that closeness was a risk he could not always afford, and I had believed that loving him meant accepting that distance as part of him. But standing there now, I understood something I had refused to see before. Distance was not something I had misunderstood. It was something I had been placed inside without realizing it was a boundary. My phone buzzed again, this time a notification I almost ignored, but I opened it anyway. It was a short message from Ethan. No explanation, no apology, just a single line asking if I had made it home. I stared at it for a long time, the screen lighting my face while the river moved endlessly behind it. Home. The word felt like a question I no longer knew how to answer. I could have replied, could have said something simple, but instead I lowered the phone and watched the message remain unanswered. The wind picked up slightly, pulling cold air across the water, and I realized I was not waiting for him anymore. I was waiting for the part of me that used to belong to him to stop responding to his absence. And in that quiet moment, standing between a city that kept moving and a river that never stopped, I understood that the hardest part of leaving someone is not walking away, but learning how to exist in the space they leave behind without trying to fill it with their shadow. I did not realize how quickly silence can become a presence until it began following me everywhere I went, not as absence, but as something alive, something that filled every corner of my day where Ethan Carter used to exist. The morning after I stood by the river, I woke up in my small apartment with the curtains half drawn and the gray light of Chicago slipping through the window like it was unsure whether it belonged there. My phone was on the table beside me, screen dark, no new messages from him. And that should have felt like relief, but instead it felt like a space that refused to close. I made coffee, I did not finish and stared at it until it went cold, realizing that even routine things now required effort I did not fully have. When I finally checked my phone again, there were more messages from Ethan, all sent during the night at different times, each one shorter than the last, as if his certainty was slowly dissolving into something less controlled. The first asked if I was safe. The second asked where I was. The third simply said my name. I did not respond to any of them. I told myself I was not trying to punish him, but that was not entirely true either. I think I was trying to understand what it meant that I could exist outside of his reach and still keep breathing. By midday, I went to work at the small design studio where I had been freelancing for months, a place that suddenly felt louder than usual, as if every conversation required more energy than I could give. My coworkers asked if I was okay, and I smiled in a way that I hoped looked convincing, because I did not yet know how to explain that I had not stopped functioning, but something inside me had quietly stepped back. Around noon, my phone buzzed again, and this time it was not a message. It was a missed call. Ethan Carter. The name lit up the screen like a reflex from another life, and I stared at it longer than I should have. I did not call back. Instead, I put the phone face down and continued working, though I could feel the awareness of it sitting there like a weight that refused to leave the room. Later that evening, when I left the studio, I noticed a black car parked across the street, too still to feel accidental. I told myself it was nothing, just another vehicle in a busy city, but my steps slowed anyway, my attention drawn to the way the tinted windows reflected the sidewalk without revealing anything behind them. I walked past it without looking directly, but I felt its presence follow me for half a block before it disappeared into traffic. That night, Ethan called again. I did not answer, but I let the phone ring until it stopped. When I finally checked it, there was a voicemail, and I listened to it even though I told myself I would not. His voice was steady at first, controlled in the way I always recognized as him trying to contain something larger. He said he did not understand why I was doing this, that things were not as I believed them to be, that distance was not what I thought it meant. But there was something different underneath his words this time, something less certain, as if the structure he always relied on was no longer holding in the same way. He ended the message by saying my name again, slower, quieter, as if saying it correctly might bring me back into a space I had already left. I sat with the phone in my hand long after it ended, listening to the silence that followed, realizing that for the first time, his voice did not pull me toward him. It only reminded me of how far I had already gone. Over the next few days, the messages continued but became less frequent, more spaced apart, like something that was learning it could not always expect an answer. I did not block him. I did not delete anything. I simply stopped participating. And in that quiet decision, I began to notice something else. The world around me did not collapse without him in it. It continued, steady and indifferent, and I realized that what I had mistaken for absence was actually space. Space that I had never been allowed to feel before. One evening, as I stood outside my apartment building, I saw another black car pass slowly down the street, and this time I did not move. I just watched it disappear into traffic and understood that whatever Ethan Carter was trying to hold on to, I was no longer standing still long enough to be found. I stopped answering his calls long before I stopped hearing his presence in my life. Because even silence can carry weight when it belongs to someone who once defined every corner of your world. Days began to blur into one another in a way that felt strangely neutral, not peaceful, not painful, just absent of the constant tension I had grown used to when Ethan Carter still occupied space in my thoughts. I went to work, I came home, I slept in fragments, and somewhere in between all of that, I learned how to exist without waiting for a sound that never came. But even absence has patterns, and I began to notice them in small ways I did not want to acknowledge. A car parked too long across the street. A shadow at the edge of a building that never seemed to move with the wind. A momentary reflection in glass that disappeared when I looked directly at it. I told myself it was my mind trying to find meaning where there was none, because that was easier than accepting that I might still be seen even when I was no longer looking back. One evening, as I left work later than usual, the sky already dark and heavy with the kind of winter air that makes every breath feel sharper, I noticed the same black car again. It was not close enough to feel threatening, not close enough to confirm anything, but it was there in the way that certainty sometimes is, quiet and persistent without needing to announce itself. I kept walking, my pace steady, refusing to change direction even as my awareness of it grew stronger. I did not look back immediately, because I knew that once I confirmed what I suspected, I would no longer be able to pretend I did not see it. When I finally did, it was only for a second. The car was still there, its windows dark, its presence unchanging, and then it turned slowly and merged into traffic as if it had never stopped at all. I told myself it meant nothing, that cities are full of repeating patterns and coincidence is often mistaken for intention, but my body did not fully believe that explanation. That night, I did not turn on many lights in my apartment. I sat by the window for a long time, watching the street below, listening to the distant sound of cars passing through intersections, wondering why my attention kept returning to places I had already decided to stop looking at. My phone was on the table, and I picked it up once, unlocked it, and stared at the empty space where his name used to appear most frequently. There were no new messages, no missed calls. Only the quiet that followed a conversation that never truly ended, just stopped continuing. I thought about deleting everything then, about erasing the last visible traces of him from my life, but something stopped me. Not hope, not curiosity, but something more unsettling. The recognition that removing evidence does not remove memory. I put the phone down and leaned back against the wall, closing my eyes, trying to understand why absence could feel so structured, so deliberate. In the days that followed, I began to notice that the world did not return to what it was before him. It had already adjusted to his presence in ways I had never fully understood, and now it was adjusting again to his absence, but not in the way I expected. It was not returning to normal. It was reorganizing itself around something I could not see. I started taking different routes home. I stopped staying late at work. I changed routines I had followed without thinking for years, not out of fear exactly, but out of a growing awareness that predictability no longer felt entirely neutral. And still, nothing happened directly. No confrontation, no interruption, no clear sign that anything was coming closer. Only the continued sensation of being observed in moments where I was most alone, like the city itself had learned my patterns too well to forget them. One evening, I found myself standing outside a small cafe I used to visit with Ethan, a place I had not entered since everything changed. I did not go inside. I simply stood there for a moment, looking through the window at strangers sitting in familiar arrangements, and I realized that memory does not require participation to remain active. It only requires recognition. As I turned to leave, my phone vibrated once in my pocket. I did not look at it immediately. I already knew, without needing confirmation, that some things do not disappear simply because we stop responding to them. They wait, quietly, for the moment we stop believing we are no longer part of their reach. I remember the moment I stopped trying to convince myself that coincidence still existed, because everything around me began to feel too precise, too intentionally aligned to be random. It was a cold evening in Chicago, the kind where the air feels sharp enough to cut through fabric, and I was walking home earlier than usual with my coat pulled tightly around me, my breath forming faint traces that disappeared almost instantly. The city looked normal on the surface, cars moving, people crossing intersections, lights reflecting off wet pavement, but nothing about my awareness of it felt normal anymore. I had learned how to live without Ethan Carter in conversation, but not without the echo of him in patterns I could not fully explain. I crossed the street near my apartment when I noticed the black car again, parked farther down than before, positioned in a way that made it easy to overlook unless you were already looking for it. I slowed my pace without meaning to, my attention sharpening even though I told myself not to react. I kept walking, but my thoughts were no longer with my surroundings. They were back in the silence he left behind, in the unanswered messages that had slowly stopped arriving, in the absence that no longer felt like absence but something structured, something maintained. When I reached the entrance of my building, I paused for a moment before going inside, and that was when I saw it more clearly. Not the car itself, but the feeling that accompanied it, the sense that distance was not the same as disconnection. I stepped inside quickly, not because I felt immediate danger, but because I no longer trusted the idea that distance meant safety. My apartment was warm compared to the outside, but it did not feel comforting. It felt contained, like a space I was temporarily allowed to occupy rather than one I truly belonged to. I placed my keys on the table and stood there for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of the building around me, trying to determine if I was imagining patterns that did not exist. My phone was in my pocket, and I took it out slowly, staring at it without unlocking it at first. I told myself I would stop reacting to things I could not confirm, that I would stop letting uncertainty shape my perception, but uncertainty has a way of becoming louder when it is ignored. When I finally turned the screen on, there was nothing new at first. No messages, no calls, only the familiar emptiness I had begun to expect. I should have felt relief, but instead I felt something closer to anticipation, which unsettled me more than fear ever had. I set the phone down on the counter and walked into the kitchen, trying to occupy my mind with something physical, something immediate. I opened the faucet, let water run over my hands, focused on the sensation of temperature and motion, but even that did not fully anchor me. It was then that my phone lit up again, not with a call, not with a message, but with a notification I did not immediately recognize. A missed alert from earlier, delayed by signal, simple and brief. Unknown number. I stared at it for a long moment before opening it, expecting nothing, or perhaps expecting everything I was trying not to think about. The message was short. It contained no explanation, no greeting, only a single sentence that made my breathing pause without warning. It said, "I told you distance does not change what belongs." I did not need a signature to know who it was from. The words were not angry, not pleading, not uncertain. They were calm in a way that no longer felt like comfort. I read them once, then again, as if repetition could change meaning, but it did not. The room around me felt suddenly smaller, not because anything had physically changed, but because the boundaries I had been trying to build inside my mind had begun to feel less stable. I set the phone down slowly, my hands steady, even though my thoughts were not. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the quiet of my apartment, and realized that the absence I had been learning to live with was no longer absence at all. It was presence in a different form, one that did not require proximity to exist. And for the first time since everything ended between us, I understood that leaving someone who never learned how to let go does not always create distance. Sometimes it only changes the shape of it. I did not sleep the night after I read his message, not because I was afraid of what it meant, but because something in me refused to accept that silence and control could still find ways to speak even when distance was supposed to end the conversation. The words he sent stayed with me like a thought that had no place to rest, repeating themselves in the quiet moments between every breath I tried to steady. Distance does not change what belongs. I had read it so many times that it no longer felt like a sentence, but like a presence sitting somewhere inside the room with me. Morning came slowly, light pressing through the edges of my curtains in a way that felt heavier than usual, and I knew before I even moved that the day would not feel normal. I went through the motions anyway, making coffee I did not drink, checking my phone I did not trust, and stepping outside into a city that looked unchanged but no longer felt neutral. I did not see the black car immediately, but I felt its absence more than its presence, like something had been repositioned rather than removed. For the first time in days, there was no shadow across the street, no reflection in passing glass that lingered too long, and that lack of pattern unsettled me more than repetition ever had. I walked anyway, because stopping felt like surrendering to a fear I did not fully understand. I found myself heading toward the river without deciding to, as if memory had taken the shape of direction. The air near the water was colder, clearer, stripped of the noise that usually filled the city, and I stood at the railing for a long time before I realized I was not alone. He was there, not behind me, not approaching, but already present in a way that made it clear he had not arrived at that moment. Ethan Carter stood a few feet away, dressed the same as I remembered, but somehow less distant than he had been in every memory I tried to hold on to. He did not speak immediately, and neither did I, because there are moments where language feels too small to contain what is already understood. The river moved steadily beneath us, indifferent to whatever history had been built above it, and I found myself noticing how strange it was that something so constant could exist beneath so much change. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than I remembered, not weaker, but stripped of the certainty I had once mistaken for strength. He said he did not come to pull me back, and I almost believed him before he continued. He said he came because silence had begun to feel different without me in it, and that was the first time I heard uncertainty in his words. I turned slightly toward him, studying his expression the way I used to when I thought I understood what control looked like on his face. I asked him why now, not because I expected an answer, but because I needed to hear how he would define the space between what he had done and what he was still trying to protect. He looked at the river before answering, as if the water could offer him something language could not, and when he spoke, he said he thought distance would simplify everything, but instead it only made him realize what he had been avoiding. I told him that distance had not changed anything for me except clarity, and when I said it, I felt something inside me settle rather than break. There was a long pause between us then, not heavy, not painful, but final in a way that did not require explanation. Ethan stepped closer, but not into my space, stopping at a distance that felt deliberate, like he was learning a boundary rather than crossing one. He said he did not know how to exist in a version of the world where I did not remain within reach, and for the first time, I understood that control and attachment are not the same thing as understanding. I looked at him, then without searching for the version of him I had once built my life around, and instead saw him as he was in that moment, a man trying to reconcile presence with loss. I told him I could not return to something that required me to disappear in order to be held, and the words felt simpler than I expected, like they had been waiting to be spoken for a long time. He did not argue. He did not ask me to reconsider. He only nodded slightly, as if accepting something he had already begun to understand before I arrived. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, but no longer binding. I turned back toward the river, letting the wind move past me without resistance, and I realized that what had once felt like being chosen had slowly become being contained. And as I stood there, listening to the city continue around us without interruption, I understood that leaving was not the end of anything that mattered. It was the first moment I had ever fully belonged to myself.